I still remember the smell of that kitchen. Pot roast. Fresh bread. The kind of dinner that was supposed to feel like home. It was a Thursday evening in October, one of those crisp Tennessee nights where the leaves were turning orange and everything looked like it was straight out of a postcard. I had spent 3 hours getting ready, not because I was vain, not because I needed to impress anyone, because my mother always told me that when you walk into a room, you walk in like you belong. There. I wanted to belong there. My name is Claire Dawson. Well, Claire Merritt now. After 4 years of marriage to Daniel Merritt. We lived in a nice 2-bedroom house in Nashville, about 40 minutes from his parents' place in Franklin. Daniel's father, Robert Merritt, had built a real estate empire from nothing. At least that was the story he told at every dinner, every holiday, every single moment he got the chance. His mother, Patricia, ran the family like a business, cold, strategic, always measuring people, always calculating their worth. And then there was Stephanie, Daniel's sister, 28 years old, beautiful in that sharp, practiced way. She had never liked me. From the very first Sunday brunch where Daniel brought me home and introduced me as his girlfriend. Stephanie had looked at me like I was something that needed to be returned to the store. I had spent 4 years trying to win that family over. 4 years of homemade casseroles brought to every holiday. 4 years of birthday cards and questions about Robert's golf game and asking Pat about her garden club. 4 years of swallowing my pride and smiling through comments designed to cut me down. But that Thursday in October was the night I stopped swallowing. We arrived at 6:30, just like Pat had requested. I wore a burgundy wrap dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings. Daniel squeezed my hand in the driveway and told me I looked beautiful. I asked him if he thought tonight would be okay. He gave me that smile, the one I had fallen in love with, and told me it would be fine. I should have known better than to believe that promise. The house was already full when we walked in. Robert's brother, Uncle Gary, was there with his wife, Donna. Their adult kids were spread across the living room. And Stephanie was already perched at the kitchen island with a glass of white wine, watching the door like she had been waiting specifically. For me, she said my name the way she always did, like it was mildly disappointing. I told her she looked great. She looked me up and down, said nothing, and turned back to her wine. Daniel pretended not to notice. He always pretended not to notice. Pat came sweeping in from the dining room in a cream blouse and pressed slacks, hair perfect, pearls gleaming. She kissed Daniel on the cheek like he was the sun itself, then turned to me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She said she was so glad I could make it, and then paused and told me my color was bold. That was the first cut of the evening, disguised as a compliment, delivered with a smile. I thanked her and told her I loved her blouse, and she patted my arm like I was a child and moved on. I offered to help in the kitchen 3 times. 3 times I was gently and firmly redirected to the living room. I sat on the edge of the couch and made small talk with Uncle Gary, who was actually kind enough to ask about my job. When we finally moved to the dining room, I noticed the seating arrangement immediately. Daniel was placed next to his father at the head of the table. Stephanie was directly across from him. Pat was at the other end. The cousins filled in the middle, and I was placed at the far corner, practically behind a decorative column next to Donna, whom I barely knew, and an empty chair that no one ever explained. It was so deliberate it almost took my breath away. I looked at Daniel. He was already deep in conversation with his father about some property deal. He had not noticed, or maybe he had and chose not to say anything. Even now, I am not sure which. One hurts more. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin. I told myself I was a grown woman and I could do this. The first 20 minutes were fine in the surface-level way that Merritt dinners were always fine. Polite conversation about politics and the Titans season and some new restaurants downtown. I ate my pot roast. I responded when spoken to. I kept my shoulders back and my chin up the way my grandmother taught me. Then Stephanie set down her fork. She looked straight at me, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, and asked if Daniel and I were ever going to have kids. The table went quiet. Pat looked up from her plate. Robert glanced over the rim of his wine glass. My heart did something complicated. Daniel and I had been trying to have a baby for 2 years. 2 years of temperature charts and ovulation tests and a miscarriage. I still cried about some nights when the house was dark and quiet. We had not told his family. It was not their business. And it was still so raw. I told her we were just enjoying being married right now. My voice was steady, careful, measured. Stephanie tilted her head and said, "She just asked because time was not exactly on my side, and she wanted to know how old I was now." I told her 33. She waved her hand like the difference did not matter and said she just thought it was important for Daniel to have children, important for the family legacy. She looked down the table at Pat and asked her if she agreed. Pat set down her fork and said the merit name did matter, especially with Daniel being the only son. I looked at my husband, who was staring at his plate. I said his name quietly. Question, a plea. He cleared his throat and said maybe they should not do this at dinner. That was it. Not that it was inappropriate. Not that we would handle our own family planning. It's just a request to postpone my humiliation to a more convenient time. Something shifted inside me right then. Something I had kept carefully locked for years rattled its cage, but I was not ready yet, 'cause it got worse. After dessert, a pecan pie I had actually brought myself, which Pat accepted without acknowledgement. Stephanie followed me to the downstairs bathroom hallway. She stopped me with a hand on my arm and told me she wanted to say something and wanted me to take it in the spirit it was intended. She looked me directly in the eyes and told me that Daniel deserved someone who fit into this family. She said she loved her brother, but the truth was that I had never really fit. She said her mom tolerated me. Her dad did not think I was good enough, and honestly, neither did she. I stood in that hallway with my grandmother's pearl earrings in my ears, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Not sadness, not humiliation, rage. I thanked her for being honest and walked back to the dining room, said my goodbyes, smiled at Uncle Gary, thanked Pat for dinner in the most gracious voice I owned. In the car, Daniel reached for my hand and asked if I was okay. I looked out the window at the dark Tennessee road and told him I was fine, but I was not fine. Because while I sat in that passenger seat quiet and still, something was waking up inside me. Something patient, something that had been sleeping for 4 years, absorbing every slight and every dismissal and every cruel little smile. I was not going to cry about the merits anymore. I was going to make them remember my name. The drive home was 22 minutes of silence. Daniel turned on the radio somewhere around exit 14. Low-volume country music. We pulled into the driveway and neither of us moved. He finally said that Stephanie did not mean it the way it sounded. I turned to look at him. Really look at him. He was staring at the garage door. I asked him which part. The part where she said his parents did not think I was good enough, or the part where she told me I had never fit into his family. He said she was direct and had always been that way. I let the words sit there. I told him I had brought a pie. I had spent $40 on pecans and 2 hours baking them, and his mother put them on the counter and never said thank you. And he had sat at the other end of that table and said nothing. He said he had asked them to stop. I told him asking them to wait was not the same thing, and I opened the car door and went inside. I changed into pajamas, washed my face, took out my grandmother's pearl earrings and set them on the bathroom counter and stared at my own reflection. For a long time, I looked tired, not sleep tired. The other kind. The kind that comes from years of performing okayness you do not feel. I went to bed before Daniel came upstairs. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard him ease carefully onto his side and sigh into the dark. I lay there and thought about Stephanie's face in that hallway, about Pat's smile that never reached her eyes, about Robert looking over his wine glass. And I thought about what they knew that I did not. The next morning, Daniel left early. I got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, and started paying attention not to feelings, to facts. I pulled up our joint bank account. Our expenses looked normal on the surface until I noticed a charge I did not recognize, a recurring one. $400 a month is going to something listed as Meridian Consulting LLC. We had never used a consulting service. We had never talked about one. I went back 3 months. It was there every single month. I Googled it. No website, no business listing, nothing. 2 days passed and Daniel and I moved around each other carefully. He brought home Thai food on Saturday, my favorite, and we watched a movie, and for a few hours it felt almost normal. On Sunday morning, he went to run errands and took my keys by accident. His car was unlocked. I do not know what made me do it. I got into his car and opened the glove compartment. Registration, insurance card, a pack of gum, a flashlight, and under all of that, a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, 3 sentences. The handwriting was not Daniel's. It said last Thursday was perfect, and that she hated that he had to go home, and that she already missed him. It was signed with the letter A. I read it 3 times. Then I sat in my husband's car in our garage on a Sunday morning and felt the floor of my life tilt underneath me. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I folded the note exactly as I had found it and put it back exactly where it was. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee and stared at the wall. Last Thursday, that was the night of the merit dinner. We had left around 9. Daniel had been quiet the whole drive home, and I had thought it was because of the tension between us. But what if he had not been thinking about that at all? When Daniel came home 2 hours later, I had breakfast on the table. Scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice. His face opened into a surprised, relieved smile. I was pleasant and warm and asked about the grocery store and traffic and the weather. And the whole time behind my eyes, I was working. I was not going to confront him. Not yet. Not until I knew everything. Not until I had enough pieces to see the whole picture. I texted my best friend Lorraine, who worked in HR at a law firm downtown, and asked if she could recommend a good private investigator, someone discreet. She called me back in for minutes and asked if it was really for a friend. I told her no. She asked how bad. I looked at the staircase and heard the shower running upstairs and told her. I did not know yet, but that I thought it might be very bad. His name was Ray Castillo. Lorraine had described him as quiet, professional, and someone who gets results. He had a small office on Nolensville Pike on the 2nd floor above a dry cleaner. I went on a Tuesday afternoon and told Daniel I had a dentist appointment. Ray was a short man in his mid-50s with calm brown eyes. He offered me coffee and I said yes, and then I sat across from him and told him everything. The note, the $400 monthly charge. The initials A. Ray listened without interrupting, took a few notes on a yellow legal pad, and nodded. Slowly when I finished, he told me to give him 2 weeks and that he would know something solid within 10 days. I wrote him a check from my personal savings account, the one I had kept separate from our joint account since before we got married. My mother's advice had always been to keep something that was only mine. I had thought she was being cynical. She was being wise. I drove home and made Daniel's favorite pasta for dinner, lemon chicken with capers and orzo, ate 2 helpings, and told me it was perfect. I smiled and said thank you and kept working behind my eyes. The first week was the hardest. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the week was ordinary. Daniel went to work. I went to work. We had dinner together 4 out of 7 nights. He rubbed my feet on Wednesday while we watched television. He sent me a funny message on Thursday afternoon. He was attentive and warm and everything a husband should be on the surface, which made me feel like I was losing my mind. Ray called on day 8 and asked if I was somewhere I could talk. I stepped into the supply room at work and closed the door. He told me her name was Amanda Cho. She was 31. She worked at Daniel's firm in the marketing department. They had been seeing each other for approximately 14 months. 14 months. I did the math without meaning to. 14 months ago, Daniel and I had gone to Gatlinburg for our anniversary. We had hiked to Laurel Falls. He had gotten us a cabin and told me he loved me more every single day. I told Ray to keep going. The $400 a month was not a consulting fee. It was going toward Amanda's apartment lease in Midtown. Ray had tracked the transfers through a credit card in Daniel's name connected to the fake LLC. He was helping pay her rent. Then Ray told me there was something else. And his voice shifted slightly. He told me my in-laws knew Patricia Merritt and Stephanie Merritt had both met Amanda Cho. He had photographs from a lunch 3 months ago at a restaurant in Green Hills. My mother-in-law, my spin-in-law and Amanda Cho, laughing, comfortable like old friends. That dinner, Stephanie's smile, Pat's hand on my arm. They knew. They had known. And they had sat across that table from me and smiled and asked about my fertility. And they knew. I told Ray I needed everything, every photo, every document, everything he had. I went back to my patient and cleaned their teeth and talked about flossing and drove home and made dinner. The report arrived Friday through an encrypted email. I opened it in our home office while Daniel watched football downstairs. I read every page. I looked at every photograph. There was Amanda at a coffee shop with my husband. At a park, entering her building while Daniel carried grocery bags. There was a photo through a restaurant window of Pat and Stephanie and Amanda, with their heads bent together, smiling. There was a receipt for a birthday dinner Daniel had charged to a card I did not have access to. He had taken her to one of the nicest restaurants in Nashville. He had told me that night he was at a client event. And then there was a screenshot from Amanda's Instagram. She had posted a photo of sunflowers with a caption about someone knowing exactly how to make her feel special. Sunflowers. Daniel used to bring me sunflowers when we were dating. I had not gotten sunflowers in 3 years, and I had told myself it was just because we were settled now, because that is what happens in a long marriage. He had not stopped buying sunflowers. He had just stopped buying them for me. I closed the laptop, sat in the dark for a while, then I started planning. Not the kind of planning that comes from panic. I was not going to call him in from the living room and scream and let him see how destroyed I was. I opened a new document on my laptop. Step 1 was to get a lawyer. Step 2 was to protect my finances. Step 3 was to find out exactly what Daniel's assets looked like. And step 4 was to figure out what the Merritt family was hiding. Because people who covered for affairs the way they had covered for Daniel's were not doing it out of simple family loyalty. They were doing it because they had something to protect. I found the attorney through the Tennessee Bar Association website. Her name was Patricia Vance, family law, 14 years of experience. Her office in Brentwood had warm wood tones and clean lines. She poured me a glass of water before I had even sat down all the way and told me to tell her where I was. I told her everything. She went through Ray's report page by page without expression. Then she asked me one question. Did I want a divorce or did I want leverage? I did not hesitate. I told her I wanted out, but that I also wanted every single thing I was entitled to. She nodded like I had confirmed something she suspected and picked up her pen. She asked me about the Merritt family finances. I told her about my gut feeling that something bigger was going on. She told me I was right to be suspicious and said that families with that kind of old money almost always have something to protect. Trusts, business structures, arrangements that depend heavily on specific circumstances. Like a son being married to the right kind of woman. I felt something click into focus. She told me to find out if Daniel stood to inherit anything and what the conditions were. I left with a signed retainer agreement and a legal pad full of notes. I stopped at a library branch across town and spent an hour searching Tennessee property, records, and Merritt holdings. What I found was substantial. Robert Merritt's company owned 23 properties across Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. The total assessed value was somewhere around $40 million. And according to a 2019 Nashville Business Journal article, Robert had recently restructured everything into a family trust with plans to transfer ownership to Daniel upon Robert's retirement. I called Patricia from the parking lot. I told her about the trust and the $40 million. She asked if Daniel had ever done work for his father's company. I told her he was a real estate attorney who had reviewed contracts and been involved in acquisition deals. She told me not to take any original documents, but to photograph everything I could while I still had access to the home office. That night, while Daniel was on a call with the door closed, I spent 45 minutes in our home office photographing everything that looked relevant. Contracts with his father's company letterhead, correspondence about property deals, a memo where Daniel had recommended a zoning attorney for one of Merit Holdings' acquisitions, a note in Daniel's handwriting about the trust restructuring with his thoughts on the tax implications. He had been deeply involved in building and protecting that empire. I transferred the photos to a secure cloud account under an email address Daniel did not know about. Before I left the office, I noticed the framed photo of us on the corner of his desk. Our wedding day. Both of us were laughing, genuinely caught off guard by the camera. I turned it face down quietly and walked out. 2 days later, Amanda Cho followed me on Instagram. I stared at the notification for a full minute before deciding it was not an accident. I did not follow back, but I looked at her profile. Most of it was private, but a few posts were visible. And then I found one she had apparently forgotten to set to private. It was a photo of a kitchen with marble countertops and a professional-grade stove. The caption said it finally felt like home. I zoomed into the background and saw a painting on the wall, slightly out of focus but unmistakable. A landscape of the Smoky Mountains in blue and green and gold. It was the same painting that used to hang in my mother-in-law's living room. Pat had given Amanda Cho artwork from her own house. She had welcomed her genuinely and practically and decorated her apartment with pieces from the family home. I texted Patricia Vance immediately and told her I had a new development. She replied within minutes and told me not to sleep on it. The next morning, Patricia told me about the trust clause. Robert Merritt had restructured his estate trust 4 years ago, around the time Daniel and I got married. The trust had one primary heir, but there was a matrimonial clause. The full assets would only transfer to Daniel if he remained in a legally intact marriage at the time of Robert's death or the trust's triggering conditions. If Daniel were divorced, his inheritance would drop to 15%. The remainder went to Stephanie's branch of the family and several charitable organizations. $40 million. 15% was $6 million. The math was brutal. This was why they had not pushed him to leave me. This was why Pat smiled at me with those cold eyes and let me help with the centerpieces. This was why Stephanie's cruelty had always stayed just below a certain line. They needed me to stay. They needed me legally attached to Daniel, kept just comfortable enough not to file. While they invited Amanda Cho to lunch and gave her paintings off their walls and waited, they were managing me. Keeping me present but powerless, Patricia told me I could use the trust against them, but that I had to move first and had to move now. Daniel's work for his father's company created a serious argument that a portion of the business assets were marital property. On top of that, there were the apartment payments through the fake LLC, the birthday dinner, and the 14 months of the documented affair. All of it is photographed and organized and ready. I asked what I should ask for in the settlement. Patricia was already writing. The house. A cash settlement opening at 30% of the estimated marital contribution to Merit Holdings' growth, which she put at a floor of $7 to $8 million. Full reimbursement of funds diverted through the fake LLC account. Attorney fees and restoration of any personal property transferred out of the marital home. Like a painting, I said quietly. She did not look up from her notepad. Like a painting, she confirmed. I filed for divorce on a Wednesday morning in late November. Daniel was served at his office. His assistant called me 40 minutes later and said nothing, just breathed on the line for a moment before hanging up. Then Stephanie called. I let it go to voicemail. Daniel called 14 times between 11 and 3. I let every call go. At 3:15 I answered. He was quiet for a moment and then said my name. I said hers. He told me to tell him it was not real. I looked out the window of my car at people pushing grocery carts and a little kid running ahead of her mother in a parka, and I felt a very deep and very quiet sadness for the version of this that could have been. For the hiking trail and the cabin and the man I had thought I was building a life with. I told him it was real. He said we could fix it, and that whatever I had found we could sit down and talk. I told him her name was Amanda Cho. I told him she lived in Midtown and that they had been together for 14 months. I told him his mother had had lunch with her and that his sister knew. I told him I knew about the Meridian LLC and I knew about the trust clause and that I knew everything. The silence on his end was enormous. I told him I wanted him out of the house by Friday and that Patricia Vance would be in touch with his attorney. Then I told him I hoped she was worth it. And I hung up. I sat in that parking lot and cried. Hard. The ugly kind I had been holding back for weeks and maybe longer. For my miscarriage that they never knew about. For 4 years of holiday dinners, where I tried so hard for the pearl earrings and the pecan pie and every small act of love. I had extended to people who were evaluating me the entire time. I let myself have 5 minutes of it. Then I wiped my face, straightened my jacket, and started the car. That evening, I sent a single email to Robert Merritt. I told him I knew about the trust, told him I knew his wife and daughter had befriended Amanda Cho while I was sitting at their dinner table being found wanting. I told him that whatever he had built it on the assumption that people like me could be managed indefinitely because we had more to lose than they did. I told him he was wrong about that. Told him my attorneys would be in touch. And I told him one last thing, the thing I had been carrying since that October dinner, since the pot roast and the pearl earrings and the hallway and Stephanie's smile. I told him I had brought a pie that night and that I had baked it with my whole heart, and that was the difference between his family and me. And that difference was the reason I was going to be fine. I hit send. Then I called Lorraine and she brought wine and we sat on my couch until midnight. And she held my hand while I cried one more time and then made me laugh the way she always could. And by the time she left, I was something I had not been in a very long time. I was ready. The Merritts had spent years looking at me and seeing someone manageable. Someone who could be kept at the edges of their table behind a decorative column, bringing pies that nobody thanked her for. They had made a serious mistake. And it was time they understood exactly who I was.